event. Since it's 3 o'clock and this is a short program, we're going to get started while other people continue to jump in. I'm Sarah Rosenkrantz. I'm the Exhibits and Education Assistant for the IU Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and I'm going to be the host for this event today. If this is your first Coffee and Curator talk, we do these once a month, and it's a chance for us to share what we're researching and using our collections for. And it's going to be a short presentation followed by a Q&A session. So feel free throughout the talk to put your questions in the chat, and I will read them off to Ed at the end. And I would like to go ahead and introduce our wonderful presenter. Dr. Ed Herrmann is the founding executive director for the IU Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and he is a research scientist in the Department of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences here at IU. He earned both his MA and PhD from IU's Department of Anthropology and has extensive archaeological experience in Germany, Montana, Ohio, Mississippi, Wisconsin, Indiana, and even more. So well-traveled. And his research interests include the role of fermentation in culture, stone tools, Paleo-Indian sites and times, and much more. And today we have the great pleasure of hearing him talk about Angel Mounds and celestial alignments. So welcome, Ed.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Before I start talking about some of the celestial alignments, I'd like to first acknowledge and honor the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Shawnee, and the Delaware people on whose homelands and resources Indiana University was built. And if you don't know much about these tribes or their cultures, I encourage you to do some research and get an understanding of their past histories and of their current vibrant and active cultures. So I also want to say it's really great to see so many researchers here today too, and folks that have an intimate knowledge of Angel Mounds. And I'm glad you're here because some of this information is really very new. We've had some publication accepted, but it's not yet out there. And I'd like you all to know that I'm giving this talk with a co-author of mine, Dr. Bill Herrmann. I'm now going to share my screen and start the PowerPoint talk. So this is an image of one of the alignments that I'll be talking about here shortly. But before I really get into it, for those of you that don't know Angel Mounds is the largest site in Indiana, and it's located in the southwestern corner of the state along the Ohio River. It's part of the Cahokian time period and polity, probably. The site had somewhere around 1,000 or 2,000 people that lived there at any one time and was occupied between about 1075 and 1425. Here's an image of the site sort of facing the southeast. And what you see here in the center is Mound A with its upper platform and lower platform. And then this conical part of the mound we call the conical offset. You can also see Mound B and L and part of J and a little bit of I here. But I'd like to call your attention to the Ohio River, which is sort of flowing at us or towards the right. And it takes this southeastern turn, but this area right here is going to be somewhat important later on in the talk, where it's straight for a few miles. The site itself, the main portion of the site, is cut off from the mainland up here by a slough, and it's down in this region where we have 11 mounds that were constructed. I'm going to be speaking mostly about the 8 here on the western side, because these are the ones that we've realized are a part of the alignments that we're talking about, alignments with the sun and the moon and the stars, in particular, the Milky Way. In order to talk about that a little bit more, I'm going to start with some days that are somewhat special on various calendars. And these are things like solstice or the equinox. And just to give you some background here that'll help you as I go through the rest of the talk, we all know that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. It's also a similar pattern for the moon, which rises in the east and sets in the west. But at different times of the year, it might rise in the east more northerly and set more to the north, or eventually set more to the south. We're all here in the northern hemisphere, so the longest day of the year for us is on the summer solstice. That's when the sun is more or less overhead, particularly at the equator. And the way the sun sets in the west, it's sort of like a pendulum, how it swings. It starts, in this case, at the solstice, more to the north, and over the course of the year will set further to the south. So the summer solstice being the longest day, the winter solstice being the shortest day, and then equinox. I'm not going to talk much about the equinox, but just to say it, the equinox is when we have an equal amount of daylight, 12 hours, and nighttime. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the summer solstice as we go through here, and even a little on the winter solstice. So the idea that there were some alignments at Angel Mounds was first published by Wolforth and Wolforth in 2000, where they hypothesized that if you're standing on Mound F, which is a mound here, and you're looking towards Mound A on the morning of the summer solstice, so at the time period of the sunrise, that you would actually see the sun rise over the center of Mound A if you're standing here on Mound F. And, you know, it might kind of, this is a little bit of a close-up from Mound F to A, and this is somewhat sort of hypothesize what that might look like. Well, we went out there a couple of years on the solstice and got this image. You saw this image in the beginning. And what this is an image standing on Mound F, first thing in the morning, and on the summer solstice, where you see here Mound A, the upper platform, here's the conical offset, and here's the lower platform just barely sticking out of the fog. And what was interesting, just before the sun rose, we couldn't even see Mound A because the fog was so thick. And then it just cleared as the sun started to rise. But there was also a building on the center of Mound A, which would be directly beneath, or appear to be directly beneath the sun as it's rising here. So we were able to confirm this, that we could see it. Interestingly, this is an image of Mound F. It was excavated by Black in the 60s, and you see here is a number of post holes, these small dots that you see, and it helps us understand that the site had a large building on it, more than a couple hundred feet long in size, and then also a fence or some sort of wall that was around it with an opening or a gap pretty close to the ramp that actually pointed directly at Mound A. And what we're thinking is it might have been related to viewing Mound A on the morning of the summer solstice. We also have a winter solstice alignment, and this is one that is sort of the angle of the river itself, such that if you were in a boat on the river on the night of the winter solstice, as the sun was setting downstream, so the river is running from right to left here, flowing. And if you were on the river, you would actually see the sun set as if it were setting in the river downstream, if there were no trees, of course, right? But this alignment is also another one of the solstice alignments. And it might be part of the reason that this stretch of the river was even chosen. Because this is a quick talk, I'm going to jump into the moon side now. So like the sun, the solstice of the moon, we call the lunistis, and sun, the solstice, sol is sun, the stis is sort of stopping. And what that is actually referring to is where on the horizon the sun, or the moon in this case, the lunistus, as it swings like a pendulum, where it is setting a little more north or a little more south during time, as it starts to go in the other direction, it appears as though it stops for a few days and sets in the exact same place. It also looks like it rises in the exact same place. But because the moon does that also, it's something that is sometimes coded for at archaeological sites. And this was something that was hypothesized by someone in the audience right now too, Stefan Peterson and Pocketat in 2010. It was discussed a little bit further and tweaked a little bit in 2021. And this is an image from a slightly more recent paper that talks about not only that there is a codified on the ground in mounds this particular alignment through Mound C, but also to the minimum south set through a series of mounds here, such that this is something that we can view. I'm going to show you an image here in a second. But it's the way the moon sets, not as quite as simple as the sun. And I'll talk about that here in just a second, but it actually takes a long period of time, over 18 years, for the cycle to complete itself. So this is something that people had to have been watching for generations in order to really get a good understanding of and eventually be able to place on the landscape itself. And the reason that the moon and the way it sets has a much longer sort of cycle is that there's a lot of moving parts that are involved with it. And what I mean by that, we're all aware of the Earth going around the sun and the moon going around the Earth, but it's complicated by a couple of factors. One is that as the Earth goes around the sun, its axis is actually tilted. And it's this tilt in the axis that means that the moon, sort of the pattern of where it rises or sets, is so complicated. That whole notion is complicated even further by the idea that the moon's orbit around the Earth is not on the same plane as the Earth going around the sun. And if that weren't quite enough, the tilt in the Earth, so the actual axis itself, wobbles. So kind of like a top that you're spinning, and as it slows down and it starts to wobble in a weird way, that's the reason why this cycle takes so long. And we have a really good idea that they were looking at it for generations because it takes 18.6 years for it to complete this cycle. This is part of the genius of the distribution of mounds on the site itself. To give you a feel of what that might have looked like, if you're standing on the lower platform of Mound A, or maybe even on Mound I, like this particular image shows here, we would be able to see the moon on this southern set that I was just showing you, and I'll show you again here in a second. But the moon would be setting right over the center of that really large building on Mound F. So it's kind of fascinating to think about if we were standing here on the lower platform, or even up here on the conical offset, that you would look through Mound I directly to Mound F on this particular, in this particular time when the moon set reached this extreme angle. So again, they need to be studying this over generations. The final part I'm going to talk about is some of the stars, and in particular, the Milky Way. We've realized over time that many of the mounds at Angel Mounds were oriented about 23 degrees east of north, like the sides here of Mound F and Mound A, and a number of the mounds aligned to one another, that this was a really important axis. Some of the houses on the site were set up 23 degrees east and north. And we think we have a really good idea as to why now. And I'm going to focus for a few minutes on these three mounds. Mound F, again, being the viewing mound, the mound from which people are standing for the perspectives that I'm about to talk about. And if on one particular day of the year, and I say one particular day, but what I mean is for a couple days before that day, it's going to look very similar. And for a couple of days after that day, it's going to look very similar. So when I say one day, realize it's actually for a few days. But this particular alignment, if you're standing on Mound F and you look 23 degrees east and north, what you'd be looking at is Mound E, this particular mound. And it would look like the sky at night, so at nightfall, that the Milky Way is sort of emanating out of this mound. And it's going across the sky at a maybe a strange angle in the sky, and it's touching one horizon, going across the sky and touching the horizon kind of behind you as well. And if you were to turn around and look behind you, the Milky Way would actually be touching the horizon on a different mound, Mound H. Another way to sort of view this is to look here. This is at sunset on a particular day, and you're probably already sort of guessing what day that is. It's the night of the summer solstice. Okay, so in the morning, we watch the sun rise over Mound A from Mound F, but at night after darkness, it's a little while after sunset, but at darkness, when you're looking 23 degrees east and north, this is what you'd be seeing coming out of Mound E. And then a few minutes later, if you were to turn around and look to the south, this is what you'd be seeing coming out of Mound H. So the Milky Way clearly is also codified on the landscape, just like the sunrise was in the morning of that longest day of the year. That same day at night, we've got alignments to the Milky Way. And I'm not going to get into a lot of the implications of that. I'm just sort of going through our observations here in this talk. But I'm going to add one more. This is a discovery found by our postdoc turned research scientist, Christina Freiberg, when she was working with the software programs that planetariums use. She also discovered that on the morning of the summer solstice, just before the sun rises, that the Milky Way is actually, if you're standing on Mound F and you look at Mound A, the Milky Way is there completely vertical in the sky, emanating as if it's coming out of Mound A. If you're standing on Mound F again and looking at it, and it's vertical in the sky, and it takes, until nighttime for that whole Milky Way to sort of change its orientation. All of that is marked by the mounds. So the real genius of this is that at Angel Mounds, and we're also seeing that this is happening at other sites, other Mississippian sites, and perhaps some older sites as well, that the people were absolutely attuned to their environment. And they were in tune in a way that allowed them to align the earth, the sky, and water in a way that's so sophisticated and absolutely brilliant in the sort of creative sense. And this is sort of the conclusion of the talk. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, but I would like to thank everybody for being here and for listening to the talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. That was wonderful. So as I said at the beginning, if y'all have any questions, throw them in the chat and I'll throw them at Ed. But to get us started, I had one. You said that a team hypothesized the alignments in 2000, I think, but what caused them to even think about that? Was there some...
Well, I believe that one of the Wolforths was very interested in archaeoastronomy and the idea that certain sites were aligned to different things. And they weren't always mounds that were aligned like the mounds we have at Angel Mounds. Sometimes there's alignments with effigy mounds and others. So it is something that's been talked about and people had looked into. And Angel Mounds, there was a number of questions that relate to, like, who were the people that founded the site? Where did they go after they left? And along with that is, why were they here? And it's some of those questions that probably led the Wolferts into thinking specifically about things like solstice alignments or lunar alignments.
Cool. Thank you. Um, Rick asked, does Cahokia have any similar alignments?
So, yes, Cahokia has various alignments. Are they identical? They don't seem to be identical. Some of the times that are sort of commemorated with what happened on the landscape there are also a little bit different. But yes, there are alignments to the Milky Way. There are solstice alignments. Cahokia also, of course, has Woodhenge that has a number of different alignments that are part of it. My colleague, Bill Romaine, may have a slightly broader answer on that. Bill, would you like to chime in?
Maybe in a minute.
Yeah, that's all right.
um, Amy was wondering if you have any book references for this topic.
Book references. Yes, and Amy, I can get some of those sent to you. The cosmological book that was published by Tim Pocketat some time ago, I believe it might have been 13, is one that talks about some of the references specific to Angel. About all we have are the Wolferth and Wolferth paper, and then a forthcoming one that will be out shortly. There are also additional books that talk about the specifics of lunar and solar alignments and events, you know, that are pretty in depth. And I can get those to you, Amy, later.
Ed, can you hear me now?
I can, Bill.
Good. So in answer to the earlier question with respect to Cahokia, there's a new article out, just a couple of months old, in the Journal of Skyscape Archaeology that discusses the Milky Way alignment of Rattlesnake Causeway. And as mentioned, Ed and I have an article coming out in Mid-Continental Journal of Archaeology, probably within a couple of weeks, that discuss the alignments at Angel. Now, the Cahokia article is also posted on academia.edu under my name. And I think I'm going to post the Angel article, the draft of it, on that same website later today. So you'll have access to the information both for Cahokia and Angel in short order. And it's already posted, as I said, for Cahokia.
Thank you, Bill.
You got it.
Paula asked, were the people at Angel Mounds familiar with Mayan knowledge, as, for example, in Chichen Itza alignments of sun and moon?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, Paula, that also leads to the idea that they're very similar. Some of the ways that people were viewing the sky, the sites were definitely set up in order to make that a little bit easier to do. The idea that they were in contact with the Mayans, yeah, we believe that that's the case. We don't have an awful lot of proof, but given the similarities of the shapes of many of the mounds and some of the layouts of the sites, in some cases, we know that we also have, not necessarily right at Angel during the Mississippian time period, but the time period slightly before that, that we see some goods that are only found, like conch shells, for instance, only found in the Gulf of Mexico or in areas further south. So while it's hard for us to say definitely at Angel Mounds, they knew it, they were making pilgrimages much further south, we don't really know that. We may find that out in the future, and that's going to be that's what's really intriguing about future archaeology. in this area.
Thanks, Ed. Sorry, I lost my place in the chat. Stefan asked, are these ideas about architectural alignments consistent with any Native knowledge you're aware of? And how do Native people you've talked to feel about these ideas?
So that's a really neat question. And, you know, the way to answer that is that we have Langford is one of the folks who spent a lot of time doing ethnographies and talking with Native American tribes. And we, for instance, know of some oral traditions that talk about the Milky Way as a path of souls or a river for the dead. And it could be that the alignments we see might be related to that. You know, right now I'm talking about observations rather than the meanings behind these things, but the tribes that I've talked to about this are very encouraging. They're very interested in this knowledge, but most of them from the removed tribes from Indiana so far that I've spoken with don't necessarily know exactly the meanings that are behind this. But for the most part, they're very encouraging and very interested in additional work. I've given this presentation to a number of tribal colleagues already, and it's very interesting to get the feel from them that this is intriguing. There's some tribes that call themselves, for instance, people of the moon. And there are others who are very interested in concepts of the Milky Way itself.
Awesome. Thanks, Ed. I think we're going to do one more because we're going over time a little bit, but it's a fascinating topic. And I'm sure Ed, if you send him an email, would love to answer more questions about you. That y'all
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah. So the last question is from Michael. He says, the astronomical alignments at Angel Mounds and other Mississippian sites are truly extraordinary. As you stated, the builders needed to make observations and mark the landscape over many years. Can you talk about any archaeologist speculations concerning how the engineering expertise behind these observatories might have diffused throughout the mid-continent? So how the ideas could have spread over there. Yeah.
So I think Bill's going to want to answer some of this, but
No.
let me start by saying we know that during this time period and the woodland period before, that people were traveling widely, that people were trading goods amongst different cultures and societies in very far-flung and distant areas. So the idea that notions such as this might diffuse through populations is a really simple step to make. We know people were talking, we know people were engaged with others in distant locations. So this sort of information would travel really fast, just like the knowledge of how to construct mounds. And so I think this was also, by the time Angel Mounds was founded, somewhere around 1075, that this is firmly ingrained in the culture and society. Like, these mounds were built prior to many of the houses moving onto the site. So this site was sort of laid out as a mound site prior to people actually living there. So this is clearly well ingrained into culture and society before this site is really even established. Bill?
I'd only add that 1,000 years before Mississippian culture, the Hopewell people were trading and receiving items from all over the country, from Yellowstone, from Florida, from Canada. I mean, thousands of miles of distance were covered by Hopewell traders of people or ideas. So in a way, when going back to the earlier question about Mayan influence, I think it's premature to draw these artificial borders between the United States and Central America or even Mexico and say, well, the Maya ideas didn't penetrate north of this particular border. I mean, it's kind of like, listen, it's not a very difficult task to paddle up or down along the coast of the Gulf. Now, the smoking gun here, of course, are the actual artifacts that may have that still need to be discovered from Mesoamerica. But that said, more and more over the last few years, it seems that Mesoamerican ideas clearly influence certainly Cahokian architecture and alignment schemes. But yeah, I think there's no question that these ideas were not only widespread throughout the Eastern Woodlands, but they go very, very deep back into the timeline.
Thank you.
So I have a question. Someone posted a website address for mounds in the UK or that came from the UK. Can somebody put that website back up, that address? It was apparently a website devoted to a discussion of the mounds at Angel, originated in the UK, but it went up and down too fast.
Bill, I think it's from Mound State Park.
Okay.
And we can certainly get that.
Okay. All right,
get
great.
that to you here.
Thanks, Amy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been fascinating, and I hope you all enjoyed it. As I said at the beginning, we do a coffee and curator talk every month to show what's happening at the museum. And next month, our education leader will be doing a talk on ethnomusicology, so musical instruments from around the world. So please tune in for that and have a great afternoon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.
Yep. Thanks. See you, Stefan.